Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the show. My name is Ethan Buchman. I lead the Tendermint and Cosmos development teams. And today I wanted to pitch you a grand narrative I've been working on that I call A Brief History of Distributed State. This is kind of one of these very high-level epics, you might say, about the history of humankind, where we've come from, where we're going, what's next, and so on. But done in a way that I promise will tie into the technology we're working on. So before I do that, though, let me just ask you, how many of you actually already know about Cosmos? All right, basically everyone. And Tendermint? Also basically everyone. So no one was expecting me to give you like any technical details about how either of those things work, right? Is that right? Do you want technical details about how those things work? Yeah, so I should do that instead of this talk? Maybe, we'll see. Maybe, we'll get into some of that at the end. We'll see how long it takes. Awesome. So thank you all for coming out early morning, and let's get started. Problem, distributed state. This is what I spend all my time thinking about. And this isn't some ad hoc esoteric problem that is only of concern to computer scientists or to blockchain geeks or people in this room. This is the fundamental problem in complex organized systems. This is the thing that is responsible for our ability to understand each other, to self-organize, to agree on a time and a place to meet, to see a conference on the history of distributed state on a Friday morning, right? If it weren't for the fact that we shared that there was a state machine replicated across all of us that allowed us to understand the English language, it wouldn't be possible to communicate, right? So distributed state is really the fundamental basic problem to human social organization, to biological organization, to the very essence and being of an organism, and of course, today, to distributed systems, to digital distributed systems, right? And what I've noticed in thinking about this stuff is that there are very strong analogies in the history of the evolution of human organizations and the history of the evolution of digital networks. And so the goal of this talk is to kind of paint those two parallel trajectories and show those analogies and show how those streams are actually starting to converge around now in the kinds of things we're all working on, in the decentralization of political unions, in the development of much more local cultures and economics, and of course in the scaling problems that are now currently facing blockchain systems. So I should just say, before I dive into that, my background is actually in biophysics. You may have guessed that or discovered that from ever talking to me. And that is because very early on, I kind of identified the same problem, and the most interesting place I saw to study it was inside the cell, right? Because inside the cell, you have this amazing cacophony of proteins and large molecules and DNA and cytoskeletal features and all this stuff kind of jostling together to do this dance that is life, right? And across that entire repertoire of molecules and organized complexity, there is extremely rich stateful information about the external world, right? And it's because of that, it's because the cell is able to maintain so much information internally about the external world that it's able to adapt and respond and survive, right? And maintain kind of a sustainable essence. And part of one of the most fundamental things a cell does is it divides. It splits in half, right? It forks, right? And so when we think about blockchain governance and blockchain scalability and the splits that happen in our communities and the problem of forking, it may be the case that we've kind of come at it slightly from with the wrong lens, right? Maybe forks and a proliferation of them aren't such a bad thing if we have a larger framework in which to understand them, if the forks are kind of happening in a more controlled mitotic manner, right? And so I don't think we're anywhere near figuring out what that looks like quite yet. And I don't even think, and this is part of the essence of my philosophy, I don't even think we can adequately design that, right? Just like no one could have adequately designed, the cell itself. No engineer can do that. No engineer can actually understand everything that's going on there in a way that they could design it from scratch. Some people might want to disagree. If you disagree, come fight me after. The point being, though, that the way the cell ultimately works is it has some common set of low-level primitives that all cells use, right? These are the basic structural features of DNA, the ATP energy molecule, right? Basic ideas around structure, functionality, relationships in proteins, right? So these basic, simple primitives allow this massively diverse set of state machines, ultimately, to operate in biological organisms that all have, they do their own things, completely different things. Some of us make certain kinds of fibers, others make other ridiculous kinds of fibers. Some organisms make slime, some organisms don't. They make other kinds of, waste or materials, whatever. But it's all happening with the same set of primitives, right? And you can think about what's going on in each cell, in a sense, as a state machine, a distributed state machine, operating on this information that comes into the cell, right, and excreting things back out, and doing stuff with it, and using that state to kind of coordinate and to stay organized, right? And so this is really the problem that has fascinated me my whole life. And when I saw, when Bitcoin showed up on my radar, and at first I didn't understand it, and then I kind of dug a little deeper, it struck me that this was the same problem happening in the same phenomenon happening now in the digital medium that I had been looking at in the biophysical medium, right? And I was floored by that, because I never had really thought about that kind of capacity of the internet in the same way. But obviously the internet is this amazing way for information to disseminate, right? But I hadn't really been struck by the actual organizational capacity of the internet in the way that it might be able to facilitate amazing higher level complexity the way organisms do, right? And ever since I started thinking about it, I haven't been able to go back. And so kind of out of that train of thought has emerged this history I'm going to paint of kind of the analogy between the evolution of complexity and organization in human systems and the same thing in digital networks, right? And so that's what we're going to go into now. Y'all with me? Cool. In the beginning, villages and city-states. So this is where we started, maybe 10,000 years ago, every human society was up to something like this, and starting maybe 5,000 years ago or so, it started to look like that, right? But it's more or less the same kind of the same kind of level of organization, in the sense that there's significant isolation. There's a very strong sense of self-sufficiency. Not just a sense of self-sufficiency. There is a very strong element of self-sufficiency that sustains these kinds of organizations. They don't have large-scale inputs from the outside, right? If they can't coordinate with each other well enough to produce everything they need to survive, they're out. The tigers are coming, or whatever. And so in these societies, you have this incredibly high self-sufficiency. You have roughly everyone more or less knowing everyone else, right? And they're coordinating on this very small scale to provide just what they need, with almost no input from the outside and no exports to the outside, right? So this is kind of where we start. And within each of these societies, there is obviously a distributed state problem. There's a state machine operating across all of the people in the society that informs them how they should behave in the world, how they should interact with each other, what their local customs are, what their religious practices are, what certain things mean. When rain doesn't fall for a few days, what is the implication of that, and what do you have to do to get the state machine going again to bring you some rain, right? And of course they have a common language, right? And same with the city-state. But it's all very, very local, attuned to your local conditions and customs, and it would be radically different from other villages or other states that aren't that far away, right? Even if they're speaking similar languages, they end up having very different customs or very different kinds of gods or whatever, right? And so a lot of the chaos of human history has kind of come down to the violent collisions between relatively closely localized communities that kind of just don't understand each other. Their state machines, in a sense, don't click, right? And we see the same thing kind of happening today in the blockchain community, where you have these colliding state machines, colliding communities, not clicking, and I'm hoping we can do something about that. So anyways, this is where we start on the human side of things. On the digital network side of things, it looks something like this. We have personal computers, not really plugged into an internet, kind of self-sufficient, doing their own thing, no access to the outside world, not really exporting anything, doing some word processing, playing some games, whatever, right? Very nice, controlled, understandable state machine. And you can think of an intranet as maybe kind of the same thing. It's a little bit of an expanded version of this. You take a bunch of these, put them together. It's like you take a bunch of villages, put them together, you get a city-state, right? So same kind of self-enclosed system. And this is where we start. But of course, very rapidly, things start to expand, and you start to get the idea, well, if you can connect computers into an intranet, maybe you can connect intranets into an internet, right? And same thing with city-states. Like, well, if you coalesce villages into a city-state, why don't you start connecting city-states into some larger entity, right? It's a very natural kind of thing to think. So what happens next? We move into the era of empires, right? And I like to call the area of empires the area of somebody else's government, right? Because this is what started to happen. You're minding your business, you're in your little village, you're in your little city-state, and down comes Alexander the Great with his massive army from Macedonia and his ridiculous customs that you've never seen before. And he's stomping through your city and telling you, okay, now we're in charge, right? And it's a really interesting predicament to be a city recently conquered by Alexander, because it's kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, he's offering you protection from all the barbarians in the vicinity that aren't part of the empire, right? So, but on the other hand, you have to pay taxes, you have to be subservient to him, you maybe have to adopt some of his gods, whatever, right? So there's that double-edged sword of kind of accepting much less responsibility yourself. You no longer have to worry as much about being self-sufficient, all this kind of stuff. You can trade with the rest of the empire, so if you can't produce enough locally, you know, Alexander's routes will allow you to ship something from some other domain, but you give up sovereignty, right? A significant amount of sovereignty, because now if Alexander is trying to fight a war off in Western Africa, he might ship your children off to go fight it on his behalf, right? So you lose a lot of the autonomy that you had when you were just your own city-state that was kind of a familial thing, right? Alexander, fortunately, was actually quite benevolent, right? He let people continue to practice their own religions and continue to have some of that autonomy and sovereignty, though they still had to give up significant elements. They had to fight in his army, and they had to pay taxes and whatever, right? So this era, I mean, Alexander's empire, you know, didn't last that long. He died young, but the same kind of thing continued on for another 1,500 years, if not more, right? Basically up until the French Revolution, you might say. But in the digital network world, somebody else's government, the age of empires, looks something like this. Somebody else's computers, right? Everyone know who this figure is? Yeah? Mr. Bezos? So this guy is the Alexander the Great of our times, right? The benevolent dictator who is slowly, if you haven't noticed, actually literally conquering the world, right? With physical locations everywhere and co-opting cities everywhere he goes into his empire, right? And it's an amazing, the same trade-off is present. It's like this guy waltzes in, says, we're gonna bring all these jobs to your city, but now you are you're a sub-state of the Amazonian empire, effectively, right? And if you're a small internet company and you have and you were used to be running your own data centers and doing kind of your own servers and doing everything yourself, right? There's a lot of cost, but there's a lot of autonomy. And then he comes around and says, hey, just load it all up onto the cloud and we'll do everything for you, right? So we'll make everything easier, but now we control your data, we control your uptime, we control the censorship and so on, right? So it's that same kind of trade-off that small city-states faced when Alexander come in, small companies or even large companies and even cities now are facing when Jeff Bezos comes in, right? And it's the fascinating thing to me is that there's this huge impetus to do this, right? Because from Jeff's perspective, it's incredibly efficient. If only the whole world were under the Amazonian empire, then there'd be no friction, right? Everyone, you'd just be able to get whatever you want, whenever you want, and everything would just be like great and glorious, right? Allegedly. But obviously that's not actually the case, because an empire as big as Amazon's or as big as Alexander the Great's is too big, it's too large, it's too geopolitically diverse to actually effectively govern, right? Such a complex society as ours, and even back then, you know, all the big empires have collapsed for this very reason. So, as these empires grow, they all start to face this problem of the world, the underlying demographic, the citizenry of the empire is too complex and too diverse to be well represented by something with such large reach, right? And then you end up finding these massive disconnects. Like Jeff made some ridiculous statement the other day. He was like, oh, I don't know how best to help humanity, so I'm gonna cash out $1 billion a year to build spaceships. And there's like a lot of people in this room who are like, yeah, it's, you know, it's a good way to help humanity. And maybe you're right. But meanwhile, he's battling the city of Seattle to pay less taxes because the rents are going up and no one can afford a home, right? So it's like, you want to help humanity. There are humans on the ground here right now, you know, but you can't even see them because your empire is so damn big. It's practically interplanetary, almost literally, right? So this is obviously not sustainable. It can't work in the long term. And so as these empires grew to these massive scales, right? Eventually they start to fracture. The citizenry is too diverse, it's too complex to be well represented by a common thing, right? So what happens next? Sovereign nations. So, beginning roughly with the French Revolution and then the American Revolution, and then everyone else has pretty much followed suit, we now have large geopolitical sovereignty that is relatively independent. Each country gets to have its own currency, it can have its own language if it wants. Most of us chose bastardized German for whatever reason. It can have its own kind of culture if it decides to, right? That kind of represents history or represents something about how they came to independence. And it's very powerful, right? And you have a new agreement on the state machine that operates in this organization, right? So in the distributed system we call Canada, there is a set of laws and there are a set of bodies that enforce those laws, and there are a set of languages that people are expected to speak and understand, and everyone participating is complying with that state machine. They speak English, or in some places they speak bastardized French. They adhere to the court systems. They follow the laws and so on. And the laws slightly vary across every country, right? Okay. The same thing is happening on the digital network space, right? The Amazonian empire is getting too big. The people are getting restless underneath, and they're saying, you know what? Let's break out of this empire. Let's develop our own sovereign digital network systems, right? And so we see the emergence of new networks that represent distinct kinds of cultures and communities and constitutions. Bitcoin is this like libertarian sound money thing. Ethereum is this big experiment in distributed state machines. Dogecoin is a testament to the power of like silliness to bring people together, and so on, right? And each of these kind of sits independently of each other one. They don't really have the strongest of connections between them. And they speak their own language, they have their own standards, and there's a little bit of communication between the larger communities, right, at the large scale. But by and large, they're kind of operating on their own, right? But none of them are really self-sufficient. None of these countries are actually self-sufficient, right? What's happened in the collapse of the empires is that these nation-states sprung up that became completely dependent on this complex web of interconnections across all of them to sustain them all, right? And so as much as we regained some kind of abstract sovereignty, we actually lost the autonomy and the sovereignty that would actually sustain us. So if all of those connections broke down, if the global supply chain and all the international relationships broke down, we would all be screwed because there's literally not enough food in the city to feed people, right? It's a little bit harder to bridge that analogy here. I mean, Bitcoin and Ethereum aren't feeding people; they're buying them Lamborghinis. So you can't eat your Lamborghini. Some of you might discover that. But it's kind of relevant because none of these have actually made any connection to the real world, except for wasting electricity. That's all they do, right? That's all they do. It's like who can waste the most electricity the fastest, right? And so, okay, running out of time, so I have to jump ahead. But the point I want to make again is that just like in the age of empires, in this age of geopolitical unions or large digital network sovereigns, the customer base, the citizenry, again, is still too large and diverse and complex. These single, large-scale political unions can't adequately represent the underlying complexity of the society, right? And so they're going to be doomed to fail in the same way that the empires were doomed to fail. So what's coming next? Well, I would argue that we're actually moving back into something like an era of villages and city-states all over again, except it's more like an era of eco-villages and metropolises, right? There's a huge resurgence of interest in local farming, in local communities, in alternative economics, in this whole like act local, think global kind of philosophy. And similarly, more people than ever live in cities, and people are far more likely to identify with their cities than they are with their nation state, right? There's huge gulfs in a country like even Canada or America between any of the different cities, right? And people in one city have a very different culture than people in another. And so, arguably, the city and the eco-village is a much more sustainable and robust foundation for globalization and for global commerce than the nation states are, because the governance of these entities can be much more representative of their constituents, right? And I think this is kind of obvious, and everyone knows this, and everyone that's involved in blockchain is very much interested in this decentralization kind of things, right? But for some reason, we don't seem to really be applying it yet to our digital networks. These guys are still large-scale nation states, and we haven't really started to think about what it would mean to break them down into a collection or a cooperative of city-states, right? And so this is one of the main things that we're proposing with Cosmos. One of the reasons I'm so interested in working on the Cosmos network is because it starts to provide a way to think about this problem, to think about the convergence now between the organization of human societies and the organization of digital networks converging in a common way so that this latest stage of digital network organization can actually match and reflect this latest stage of social organization where we have local communities, cities that are running relatively autonomously and self-sufficiently using digital infrastructure that they're hosting themselves, right? And that is enabling them to govern and to reflect in their digital networks what is happening in the real world, right? Unfortunately, I am out of time. This is the reason I got into the blockchain space, is to work on local currencies and representing real world value in digital networks in a way that is actually reflective of the people and their commercial interactions and personal interactions and so on. And I think we're getting to a point where this is starting to get very real, and this kind of convergence is actually important both for the scalability of our political structures and for the scalability of our digital network structures, blockchains included. So thank you very much.